Welcome. On January 24th, 1878, Vera Zazilic shot the governor of St. Petersburg, Russia. The shooting was premeditated and carried out with the express purpose of initiating a wave of terrorist violence intended ultimately to overthrow the Russian monarchy. Zazilic was part of a terrorist cell, specifically an anarchist cell. They believed that disparities of wealth and status in Russian society would only come to an end if a new, socialist world were brought into being. In the short term, Zazilic failed, but she did inspire others, and not just in Russia. Among the victims of this violence were numerous heads of state, such as those of Russia, Italy, and the United States, to name just a few. These assassinations were consistently fueled by belief in the viability of terrorism and the promise of a more egalitarian future. Today, we'll look at this unparalleled wave of terrorism, how it set the world on edge, and how it ultimately led the way to the First World War and the Russian Revolution. The modern conception of terrorism ultimately goes back to the French Revolution. But the terrorism that swept the globe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was different from earlier forms of terrorism in one very important respect. It often made use of dynamite, which was then a new invention. But despite its political use, dynamite was not developed for political purposes. Its inventor was a Swedish scientist named Alfred Nobel. The same Alfred Nobel, whose last name is on the modern-day Nobel Peace Prize. He invented dynamite in 1866 with a simple goal: to improve civil engineering when it was necessary to blast through rock. It did not occur to him that dynamite would be used for political ambitions, and specifically terrorism. His invention made him quite rich, but he was outraged by its misuse. He didn't want to be remembered as someone who unwittingly aided terrorists. So, in his will, he directed that awards should be given in his name to those who had done the most work during the previous year to help humanity. And the Nobel Peace Prize is still given today, each year on December 10th, the date of Nobel's death. The first of these great assassinations occurred in Russia. On March 1st, 1881, Tsar Alexander II was killed by a dynamite bomb. It was thrown by a member of a terrorist group called the People's Will. Assassinating Alexander II was, in many ways, an utterly bizarre political choice. In truth, he had been the most reform-minded Russian Tsar of the previous 2 centuries. He abolished serfdom and pursued extensive reforms of existing land law. Some contemporaries compared him with Abraham Lincoln, because just as Lincoln freed America's slaves, Alexander II freed Russia's serfs. But his assassination came as a surprise for a second reason. His coach was bomb-proof, but members of the People's Will threw a bomb at it anyways. The bomb exploded, but the Tsar was unharmed. He then got out of his coach, and he questioned the bomb thrower. At this point, a second member of People's Will threw a second bomb, and this one killed the Tsar. Those involved were caught and executed, but not all members of People's Will were rounded up. 5 years later, in 1886, they tried to assassinate the Tsar's son, Alexander III. They failed, but this failure had a remarkable afterlife in Russia and ultimately in global history. Among those involved in the attempt on Alexander III was a young man named Alexander Ulyanov. He was the older brother of Vladimir Ulyanov, better known today as Vladimir Lenin, who helped lead the Bolsheviks to victory in the Russian Revolution. And, like the People's Will, the Bolsheviks believed in the use of terrorism. In order to unpack the development of anarchist terrorism, we need to explain 3 different political terms: anarchism, nihilism, and the great catchphrase, propaganda by the deed. First, the word anarchism comes from the Greek. The Greek letter alpha operates here as a prefix, negating what follows it, that is the word arche, which means authority. Combine these together, and you get anarchy, literally no authority. For the earliest anarchists, anarchy specifically meant the lack of a monarch. In the words of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, writing in 1840, anarchy is the absence of a master or a sovereign. In its opposition to monarchy, anarchism was part of the 19th century political left. But later anarchists saw their movement in more expansive terms. To quote the influential anarchist Peter Kropotkin, in an article written in 1910 for the Encyclopaedia Britannica, societal harmony would be obtained, in his words, not by submission to law or by obedience to any authority, but by free agreements. So how does terrorism fit here? The answer comes from what was originally a separate school of thought, nihilism. And this is our second point. The word nihilism was popularized in the 1862 novel Fathers and Sons by the Russian novelist Ivan Turgenev. Today, nihilism is generally taken to mean belief in nothing, because the word nihil is Latin for nothing. But nihilism originally had a different meaning. It was the refusal of deference to others. It was, therefore, a rebellion against hierarchy and thus authority. It could involve rebellion against any number of cultural practices. From the nihilist standpoint, there was something positive in rejecting deference. Nihilists saw themselves as proponents of equality, and they often cited the ideals of the French Revolution. And this leads us to our third point. One of the great catchphrases of anarchists was propaganda by the deed. The origins of the phrase are not well known, but an anarchist congress meeting in London in July 1881 adopted it as a statement of policy, and thus, several months after the assassination of Alexander II, anarchists like Kropotkin envisioned violent acts leading initially to revolution, but ultimately to a better tomorrow. But this isn't what happened. Violent acts simply became terrorism. Anarchism inspired violence against both heads of state and larger groups of citizens. In 1878 alone, assassination attempts were made on the kings of Russia, Germany, Spain, and Italy. But this soon gave way to success, mostly in the later 1890s, as a wave of assassinations swept across the Western world. Nothing like this had ever happened before, and nothing like it has happened since. To name just a few of the major victims, the Empress Elizabeth of Austria was killed in 1898. King Umberto I of Italy was assassinated in 1900, and in the United States, President McKinley was assassinated in 1901. But during this period, anarchists also attacked the wider populace, doing such things as bombing police, as happened in Chicago in 1881. They bombed cafes, as happened in France in 1894. In still other instances, they used other weapons, such as acid, knives, and guns. Sometimes these acts were organized, but sometimes not. And this points to the simple fact that anarchists sometimes attracted what we today would call lone wolf terrorists. One such figure was Leon Czolgosz, who assassinated President McKinley with a gun. He had no connection to any known anarchist group, but he read anarchist publications and was inspired by them. Due to the geographical spread of anarchist terrorism, some suspected a vast international conspiracy organized by anarchists. There's no real evidence of such a plot, but there's no denying that the more extreme of anarchist ideas were limited by neither language nor by borders. Perhaps ironically, anarchist opposition to overarching authority structures spurred an unprecedented amount of cooperation between governments. But this took time. The first attempt at controlling anarchist terrorism happened at the national level. Here we come to a facet of this history arguably as perverse as terrorism itself. In order to try and ferret out terrorists, police spies infiltrated such groups, but they couldn't arrest the members of such groups if they hadn't done anything illegal. And so, we find instances in which police spies, posing as anarchists, encouraged violent acts in order to arrest those who later committed them. There is a technical term for this, agents provocateurs. Their involvement makes it difficult to know the full extent to which anarchists themselves aimed at terrorism. For example, earlier I mentioned that in 1881, an anarchist congress in London adopted the phrase propaganda by the deed. Agents provocateurs were among those in attendance, and they voted for the policy. But a purely national approach to anarchist terrorism was ultimately of limited effectiveness. Germany was the first country that called for international cooperation. Other countries showed some interest, but not Britain, which was then at the height of its imperial power. So, initially, Germany was joined by Austria and Russia in 1873, in what was called the Three Emperors' League. And yet, even without formal cooperation, different European governments paid attention to the laws passed in different European lands. In the mid-1880s, for example, multiple nations passed laws against the criminal use of dynamite. International cooperation grew because embassies came to focus, in part, on matters of national and ultimately international security, becoming hubs for the exchange of information. When anarchist violence surged in the 1890s, most European nations were ready to join forces. Police agencies entered into an unprecedented degree of international cooperation, and the United States did so too, following the assassination of President McKinley. So what? There are numerous so whats in all of this. One, as we've already seen, was the development of the Nobel Peace Prize, but there are other, more tragic, long-term influences from the decades of anarchist terror. One began on June 28, 1914, when Gavrilo Princip assassinated Franz Ferdinand, Archduke of Austria and heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. In the weeks that followed, the assassination set in motion a domino effect that ultimately led to World War I. It involved most European nations, their global empires, and significant portions of the rest of the world. Princip belonged to a group called the Black Hand. They were Serbian nationalists who embraced terrorism, thus drawing them into the orbit of the various anarchists we've already discussed. In the weeks following the assassination, but before the beginning of the First World War, some alleged that Princip was a secret agent. By 1914, it was common to allege that terrorists were indeed secret agents rather than extra-state actors, either engaging in or advocating terrorist acts. The existence of agents provocateurs and the publications of police autobiographies, which sometimes detailed police involvements in terrorist acts, only validated such fears. Karl Marx, for example, had alleged that Mikhail Bakunin, an anarchist socialist, was employed by the Russian government. But it wasn't true, nor is there any evidence showing that Princip worked for the Serbian government, as some back then alleged. But of course, such claims looked plausible because such claims were so often made. But we could look beyond World War I and take the story into the Russian Revolution, which began in 1917. We've already noted the familial connection between the brothers Alexander Ulyanov of the People's Will and Vladimir Lenin of the Bolsheviks. In fact, although the Bolsheviks looked to Karl Marx for some of their ideas, they also incorporated anarchist elements of the sort that Marx had explicitly rejected, namely terrorism itself. For example, Bolshevik leader Leon Trotsky wrote in defense of terrorism, and his advocacy of such methods helped define Bolshevism over and against many other socialist groups, including those that were Marxist. To now summarize, it's not unfair to say that between World War I and the Russian Revolution, we find not just the end of the 19th century, but the beginning of the 20th. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. First, for a full consideration of Vera Zasilic, read Anna Siljak's book, Angel of Vengeance, the girl who shot the governor of St. Petersburg and sparked the age of assassination. Siljak covers not just the event itself, but the larger history of anarchist thought, both within and beyond Russia. Next, for a broad study of anarchist terrorism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, read Richard Bach Jensen's study, The Battle Against Anarchist Terrorism, in International History, 1878 to 1934. Equally engrossing and exhaustive, it covers everything from agents provocateurs to the developments of modern intelligence agencies in nations as diverse as Britain, Russia, and the United States. Finally, if you're interested in lone wolf anarchist terrorism, read The Dynamite Club, How a Bombing in Fin de Siècle Paris Ignited the Age of Modern Terror by John Merriman. He analyzes the 1894 bombing of a cafe in Paris. It's a deep dive that covers everything from major intellectual currents to the mythology surrounding such acts that developed in the popular press. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button. Feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.